The horse had been standing in that same corner of the pasture for 11 years. 11 years of sunrise and shadow. 11 years of wind through tall grass, of neighbors shaking their heads over the fence, of a woman named Constance walking slowly across the dew-wet field every single morning with a bucket in one hand and something close to devotion in her eyes. Everyone in Harlow County knew the story, or thought they did. They said the horse was useless, broken, a money pit with 4 hooves and a bad attitude. They said Constance was grieving herself into poor decisions, the way widows sometimes do, holding on to things that remind them of what they've lost, even when those things cost more than they're worth. They were wrong about almost everything, because the morning Constance reached up into the thick silver mane of that aging quarter horse named Riddle, the morning her fingers found the worn leather cord and pulled loose a small brass key that had been knotted there for 50 years, that was the morning every whisper, every smirk, every well-meaning warning turned to silence. What that key opened changed the story of everything. And the story had been waiting a long, long time. Before we go any further, I need to ask you something. Have you ever held on to something that everybody else told you to let go of? A person, a place, an old habit that felt too close to love to simply release? Because Constance held on for 11 years. And what she found at the end of that patience? Well, it wasn't what anyone expected, including her. Drop a comment below and tell me, where are you watching from? And if this story speaks to something in your chest before it's even finished, leave a like. It helps more than you know. And if you're new here, subscribe, because this channel is where stories like this one find their way home. Alright, let's begin. Harlow County sits in the flat, wind-polished middle of eastern Montana, where the sky is so wide it feels like a kind of pressure, beautiful and relentless at the same time. The land there doesn't forgive softness. The ranches are old, the fence is older, and the people carry a particular kind of toughness that comes not from cruelty, but from survival. You learn, out there, to be practical, to see things as they are, not as you wish them to be. Constance Vale had lived on the Vale property her entire life, 61 years as of the spring this story really begins. She was born in the farmhouse her grandfather built, grew up between its walls, and married a man named Walter Vale when she was 24 years old, partly because she loved him and partly because she couldn't imagine a life that didn't include that particular piece of earth under her feet. Walter had been something in this county, not famous, not wealthy, but respected in the way that certain men are respected, quietly and without ceremony. He knew horses the way some people know music. He had a gift for reading an animal's mood before it expressed itself, for understanding what a creature needed when the creature itself couldn't say. He'd trained quarter horses for 30 years, for rodeo, for ranch work, for competitions across 3 states, and every horse that passed through his hands came out better for having been there. He died of a cardiac event on a Tuesday morning in October, 11 years ago. He was 62 years old, was drinking his first cup of coffee, and was gone before the cup went cold. He left Constance the property, a modest savings account, a barn full of equipment, and 1 horse she hadn't known about. His name was Riddle. The neighbors' reactions to Riddle began almost immediately. He was a gray quarter horse, older than most working stock. The vet estimated he'd been born sometime in the mid-90s, which made him roughly 20 at the time Walter died, though nobody could confirm that with any certainty. There were no papers, no registration, no documented lineage. He had appeared in Walter's barn about 3 months before Walter's death, and Walter had told Constance only that he was a horse with a past worth knowing. She hadn't pushed for more. Walter was like that. He revealed things slowly, in his own time, and she'd learned to be patient with his silences. But after Walter was gone, the horse became a problem. He was difficult to handle, not dangerous, not aggressive, but deeply reluctant. He would come to the fence for Constance and no one else. He refused to be ridden by strangers, pulling away from every saddle with quiet, immovable resistance. The farrier had to be accompanied by Constance every visit. The vet, the same. Without her present, the horse simply would not cooperate. The ranchers nearby began to talk. Terrence Boyle, who ran the largest operation in the county and had an opinion about everything on 4 legs, said the horse was neurologically compromised. A neighbor named Phil Dutton, who had helped Constance clear fence lines in the months after Walter's death, looked at Riddle and shook his head slowly. "That animal has never done a day's work in his life," he said, "and he won't start now." Constance's daughter Nora drove up from Billings twice a year, and every visit, gently suggested that Riddle be sold, or if no buyer could be found, humanely retired. "Mama, you're spending money you don't have on a horse that gives you nothing back," Nora said, not unkindly. "That's not sentimentality. That's just cost." But Constance kept the horse. She kept him because of something Walter had said the last Sunday he was alive, standing at the kitchen window looking out toward the pasture where Riddle stood in the amber late afternoon light. "That horse," Walter had said slowly, like he was reading something he'd been meaning to translate, "is the last good thing I did. I just haven't figured out how to explain it yet." She had understood, in the way that long marriages create a private language, that he would explain it soon. He just ran out of time. So she kept Riddle, fed him, walked out to the fence every morning, let him rest his heavy gray head on her shoulder the way he liked to do. And she waited for the explanation to come, even though the man who owed it to her was gone. The first year after Walter's death was the hardest of Constance's life, and she had not lived an easy one. There was the grief, of course, the particular, disorienting grief of losing a spouse, which is different from other losses because it removes not just a person, but an entire architecture of daily life. The small rituals, the sound of another person breathing in the dark, the way a house holds a shape when it's built around two people, and how that shape doesn't simply adjust when one of them disappears. Constance had expected sadness. She had not expected how large the silences would become. But there was also the practical weight of managing the property alone. Walter had handled most of the heavy maintenance, the fencing, the equipment upkeep, the relationship with the county assessor's office, the annual renegotiation of grazing leases on the eastern acres. Constance had always been capable, always been present in the decisions, but she hadn't driven those conversations alone. Now she did. She learned quickly. She also made mistakes, the way you do when the learning happens in real time with real consequences. One bad lease decision in her second year cost her nearly $12,000. She had to sell 2 of the 3 remaining horses Walter had kept on the property. Riddle she kept. The Boyle family, whose land bordered hers to the north, had been watching. Terence Boyle was not a cruel man, but he had the particular ambition of someone who had always believed that adjacent land was simply land waiting to be consolidated. He had made offers on the Vale property twice while Walter was alive. Reasonable offers, Walter always said, just not reasonable enough. After the death, the offers came again, and they came with more frequency and a softer, more sympathetic tone. "I'm not trying to take advantage of your situation," Terence told Constance at the grain cooperative one afternoon, a year and a half after Walter died. "I just want you to know the offer stands. If the time comes when keeping that place going is more than you want to carry, you've got a neighbor who's ready." Constance thanked him and bought her grain and drove home. She was not angry at Terence. She was something more useful, clear-eyed. She understood the offer for what it was, patient opportunism dressed in concern. She'd seen it before. She would see it again. What she hadn't seen before was what happened that winter with Riddle. It was January, deep cold, the kind that settles into the bones of a Montana night and doesn't lift until March. Constance was doing the evening feeding, hay and a measured portion of senior feed, which Riddle's aging teeth required, when she noticed the horse standing differently than usual. Not distressed, not ill. Still, unusually still, even for him. His head was lowered, and he was looking at her with an expression she had no word for except something like deliberate. She stood at the fence and watched him. He lifted his head and stepped toward her slowly, and when he reached the fence rail, he did something he had never done before. He pressed his forehead against hers. Not the side of his head, his forehead, directly, with a kind of measured intention that made Constance's breath catch. She stood there in the cold dark with her forehead against a horse's forehead, and she felt, without being able to explain it, that something was being communicated. She told this to no one, because she knew how it would sound, but from that night forward, she paid closer attention to the horse. She noticed things she had been too distracted by grief to notice before. The way he never allowed anyone near his left side. The way he sometimes stood at the far edge of the pasture looking north, in the direction of the old timber lease land that the county had sold off years ago. The unusual weight and density of his mane, which was long and silver-streaked and which she had never bothered to brush through completely, not because she'd neglected him, but because he preferred it untouched. The one vanity, she'd always thought, of an otherwise undemanding animal. She started brushing it, not all at once, gently, working through sections, following his reactions. He didn't resist, but he watched her carefully as she worked, and after the third or fourth session, she found the first unusual thing. It was not the key. Not yet. It was a small piece of leather, braided and knotted into the deepest section of the mane, close to the crest. It had been there so long that the hair had partially grown around it, incorporated it, the way living things absorb what cannot be removed. She worked it loose gently over 2 evenings. It was a braided loop, about 3 inches long, attached to nothing now, but the ends were cut clean, not broken. Whatever had been attached to it had been removed deliberately and tied in the leather, almost invisible unless you were looking, a small inscription. For letters burned with what looked like a sewing needle into the hide of the leather. WV6. 4. Walter Vale. And 2 numbers. She sat down on the cold ground right there in the barn, and for the first time since his funeral, she cried, not from sadness, but from the strange, vertiginous feeling of receiving a message that had been waiting 11 years to be read. The numbers occupied Constance for the better part of 2 weeks. WV6. 4. Walter Vale. She was certain of that. But 6 and 4, a date? A combination? A location? She went through Walter's papers again, more carefully this time, looking for anything that matched. He had kept records the way meticulous men keep records. Organized, annotated, comprehensive. There were ledgers going back 30 years. Horse registrations, breeding records, veterinary invoices, tax files and blue folders, receipts for equipment, organized by year. No mention of a number 64. No safe, no lockbox, no combination lock she'd ever seen. She asked Nora when her daughter called on a Sunday, "Did your father ever mention a box or a safe? Anything with the number 64? A pause on the line. Not that I remember. What? I found something in the horse's mane. His initials and a number. Another pause, longer. Mama, the horse's mane. I know how it sounds." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Do you want me to come up?" "Not yet," Constance said. "I want to think about it first." She went to the county records office in the second week of February and spent an afternoon with the property archives. 40 years of records. She was looking for anything that linked the number 64 to the Vale property, to Walter's history, to any transaction or event she might have forgotten. She found it on a Tuesday morning, 6 days later, in a box of Walter's old rodeo records she'd stored in the attic and not touched since the funeral. It wasn't a document. It was a photograph. Walter, young, maybe 25, 26, standing next to an older man she didn't recognize, outside what looked like a bank. Not the county bank. Something older, with a stone facade and tall windows. Both men were smiling at the camera with the slightly formal quality of people who are happy but not entirely comfortable with cameras. Between them, held by the older man, was a small iron box, old-fashioned, the kind with a hinged lid and a keyhole on the front. On the back of the photograph, in Walter's handwriting, Gifford, 1974, the promise. Constance sat in the attic for a long time. She had known Walter for 37 years. She had married him at 24 and buried him at 50. In all that time, she had never heard him mention a man named Gifford. Not once. Not in passing. Not as an old friend, a former partner, a distant relative. The name was completely new to her, and she had believed, until that moment, that she knew all the names. This was unsettling in a way she couldn't immediately categorize. Not because she suspected anything dark, she had no reason to, and she was not by nature a suspicious woman, but because the idea that the man you built your life with carried a story you'd never heard, a story significant enough to encode in a horse's mane and preserve in an attic box. That idea sat in the chest differently than you'd expect. She went back to Riddle the next morning. She worked through the mane again, methodically, section by section. This time she was looking, not just grooming. And there, in the thickest section, near the base of the neck, where the hair had always been slightly matted no matter how often she tried to smooth it, she felt it. A small, hard object. Her fingers traced its shape. It was smooth on most sides and had an irregular top. Notched, she realized, like teeth. She worked with both hands, parting the mane carefully, finding the leather cord it was tied to. A simple knot. She worked it loose in the cold morning air, while Riddle stood completely still, his breathing slow and even, as though he'd been waiting for this moment longer than she had. She held it up in the light. It was a brass key, small, older than old, the kind with a round bow and a long, simple shaft. like the keys she'd seen in photographs from the early 20th century. Safe deposit keys. Lockbox keys. The kind that opened something small and permanent and meant to last. The word Gifford was stamped on the bow. Constance turned the key over in her hand, and the two pieces, the photograph, the inscription, the name, came together the way things do when they've been separated too long, with a small, almost audible click. Gifford, 1974, the promise. She went inside and called the county library. The librarian's name was Margot, and she had been at the Harlow County branch for over 20 years, long enough to know where everything was, including the things that nobody had asked about in decades. Constance described what she was looking for: any record of a person or a business named Gifford operating in the county or the adjacent region in the early to mid-1970s. Margot went to work without asking for an explanation, which was one of the things Constance appreciated about her. It took 3 days. When Margot called back, she had found 2 things. The first was a small item in the county paper from the spring of 1974, a brief notice, barely a column inch. It announced the retirement of a man named Harlan Gifford from the position of vice president at a private agricultural trust called the Palliser Land Conservancy. The Conservancy, the notice said, had operated in eastern Montana and parts of Wyoming since 1951, managing long-term conservation easements on privately held land. Harlan Gifford had served the organization for 19 years. The second was an obituary from 1989. Harlan Gifford had died at age 71. He was survived by no immediate family. He was described as a man who had devoted his professional life to what the obituary called ensuring that land that should remain wild remains wild. He had left no estate of note. He had lived, in his final years, in a small house outside the town of Crater Falls, 30 miles north of Harlow County. Constance read both pieces twice at the library counter, then asked Margot to make copies. "Do you know what the Palliser Land Conservancy is?" she asked. Margot tapped her keyboard for a moment. She said. It dissolved in 1986. Financial difficulties, apparently. There's a note in the state nonprofit registry. It looks like they held a number of conservation easements, agreements where the landowners gave up development rights in exchange for tax benefits and a guarantee that the land would stay in its natural state. When the conservancy dissolved, the question of who administered those easements became complicated. Complicated how? Well, if the conservancy no longer exists, who enforces the easement? Legally, it depends on how the original agreement was structured. Some easements transferred to state conservation authorities. Others just lapsed. And some, Margot paused, still reading something on her screen. Some were held in a kind of legal limbo that apparently still hasn't been fully resolved. Constance drove home slowly. She knew what conservation easements were. Walter had discussed them over the years in the context of the neighboring timberland. The Palliser Acres, people still called them informally, a stretch of about 400 acres to the north that had never been developed, never been logged, never been farmed, despite sitting in the middle of otherwise fully worked agricultural land. Everyone assumed the county owned it. No one had ever been entirely certain. She knew something else now, too. She knew that Walter had known Harlan Gifford in 1974 when he was a young man, before Constance had come into his life. She knew that a photograph had been taken outside what looked like a bank, and that the words written on the back said the promise. Not a promise, not their promise, but the promise, as though it were something specific and named. And she knew that a key stamped with the word Gifford had been hidden in a horse's mane, in a place it would only be found by someone patient enough and devoted enough to look. She stopped the truck at the top of her driveway and looked north across the flat winter fields toward the far tree line where the Palliser Acres began. She thought about Walter standing at the kitchen window. The last good thing I did. That evening, she called a lawyer, not the county lawyer who had handled the estate, but a woman in Billings named Sylvie who specialized in property law and had been recommended by a friend. She described what she had found, without embellishment, in the order she had found it. She described the key, the photograph, the inscription, the conservancy. She asked what it might mean. Sylvie listened without interrupting. When Constance finished, there was a brief silence. Then Sylvie said, carefully, if Walter held an interest in an easement agreement with a dissolved conservancy, particularly if he was a party to the original agreement, there's a possibility that certain rights or obligations transferred with the land itself, not with the organization. Do you know if the key goes to anything? A lockbox? A safe deposit box? The word Gifford is stamped on it. I assume it opens something that Gifford had. Then, Sylvie said, we need to find what that something is. She drove to Crater Falls the following Saturday. Crater Falls was the kind of small town that had been reduced, over generations, to its most essential version of itself: a grain elevator, a diner, a post office, and 2 bars. The house where Harlan Gifford had spent his final years was easy to find. The postmaster knew it immediately, as postmasters in small towns generally know everything. It was now occupied by a man named Otto, who had bought it from the county tax auction in 1991 and had lived there since with a studied lack of ambition that he seemed to regard as a philosophy. He was in his 70s now, heavy-set, with large hands and a way of listening that reminded Constance of certain horses, fully present, unhurried, slightly wary. She showed him the photograph. He looked at it for a long time. That's Harlan, he said finally. You knew him? Bought the house from the county after he died. Found some of his things in the cellar when I moved in. Kept them because I didn't know what else to do with them, and the county didn't want them back. He looked at her steadily. What's this about? She told him as much as she thought he needed to know. He listened, then disappeared into the house for several minutes. He came back carrying a wooden crate, the kind that had once held canned goods or hardware, old and dry and held together by habit as much as by its original construction. Inside were papers, old papers, folders and envelopes, yellow at the edges, bound with string that had long since lost its tension and simply held form. I never went through it all, Otto said. Seemed like it wasn't mine to go through. Constance asked if she could. He said yes, on the condition that she told him what she found. She agreed. She spent 4 hours at Otto's kitchen table, working through the contents of Harlan Gifford's personal files. Most of it was the administrative residue of a long career, correspondence with county assessors, letters to and from other conservation organizations, financial reports from the Palliser Land Conservancy that read like all institutional documents, densely technical, precise, and absent of human voice. But near the bottom of the crate, she found a folder tied with red string. On the tab, in Gifford's handwriting, Vale Agreement, Private. Her hand steadied. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a legal agreement, 4 pages, typed on Conservancy letterhead, dated March of 1974. It was a conservation easement in the standard form she had come to recognize from her research, but with one unusual addendum on the final page. The addendum stipulated that the easement was to be administered not by the Conservancy alone, but jointly by the Conservancy and a named steward, a person responsible for monitoring and maintaining the terms of the agreement in perpetuity, or until such time as a successor steward was formally designated. The named steward was Walter Vale, and the land in question was not someone else's property. It was the 400 acres to the north of the Vale farm, the Palliser Acres, which the agreement specified had been donated to the easement in 1974 by Harlan Gifford himself, using a portion of his personal savings, on the condition that they would never be developed, never be logged, never be converted from their natural state. He had bought the land specifically to protect it, and he had asked a 25-year-old man named Walter Vale to be its guardian. The second document was a letter, handwritten, 2 pages, from Harlan Gifford to Walter Vale, dated December of 1988, the year before Gifford died. The letter was quiet and practical in its opening, discussing the Conservancy's financial difficulties and the likelihood of its dissolution. But the second page changed in tone. Gifford wrote, I know I am asking more of you than I had a right to ask when you were young, and I was less honest about the weight of it. The Conservancy will not survive. The agreements will not be formally upheld, but the land will still be there, and the promise we made to it, not to each other, not to any institution, that promise is not dissolved by paperwork. I am leaving the key with the land's guardian because I believe the guardian will know what to do with it when the time is right. I believe that because I have watched you for 15 years and you have never once treated this as a burden. You have treated it as a privilege. I hope whoever holds this key after you sees it the same way. The key had been left with the land's guardian. Walter had been the land's guardian, and Walter had given the key to the only creature he trusted to carry it without ever losing it, without ever being searched, without ever being separated from the person who would eventually need to find it. Constance sat at Otto's kitchen table for a long time, holding the letter. She thought about what the Palliser Acres represented, 400 acres of unencumbered natural land, sitting to the north of her property, in a county where land prices had increased significantly over the past decade. She thought about what it would mean, legally, if the stewardship agreement could be revived or its terms enforced. She thought about Terrence Boyle, who had been offering to buy her land for 11 years. She thought about what Nora would say when she told her. She thought about Walter, standing at the kitchen window. The last good thing I did. On the drive back to Harlow County, she called Sylvie. The legal process that followed was not swift, and Constance would be the first to tell you that it was not simple. Montana property law, overlaid with decades of dissolved institutional agreements and the particular complications of conservation easements without active administrators, was the kind of territory that takes patience and a very specific kind of lawyer. Sylvie was that kind of lawyer. The first challenge was establishing Walter's standing under the original 1974 agreement. The document existed. The signatures existed. The land still existed in exactly the condition it had been in at the time of donation, unlogged, undeveloped, its natural hydrology intact. But the conservancy that had issued the agreement was legally dead, and Walter, the named steward, was also dead. The question of whether Constance, as his heir, could claim the stewardship mantle was not immediately obvious. Sylvie spent 6 weeks building that argument. She pulled the original Conservancy Articles of Incorporation from the state archives, found a provision that allowed stewardship agreements to pass to heirs unless otherwise specified, and obtained a legal opinion from a colleague at the University of Montana's Law School, confirming that the argument was sound under current state precedent. She filed a claim with the county recorder's office in March. The response, when it came, was not from the county. It was from Terrence Boyle. His lawyer sent a letter within 2 weeks of the county filing, asserting that the Palliser acres had been subject to a tax lien since 1991 and that Boyle had been in informal negotiations with the county over a potential purchase. The letter was politely worded and made no accusations, but its meaning was clear. Boyle had been watching this land for a long time, and he was not going to yield it without a fight. Constance read the letter at her kitchen table. She set it down next to a cup of tea. She looked out the window toward the north pasture, where Riddle was standing in the spring sunshine, head up, apparently interested in a hawk that was circling somewhere above the far tree-line. She was not afraid. She was something more durable than afraid. She was decided. Sylvie pushed forward. She challenged the lien, which, it turned out, had been improperly recorded based on a clerical error in the original tax assessment that had miscategorized the donated conservation land as fee-simple private property. This was not unusual with easement land from that era. The Conservancy's dissolution had left a number of accounting irregularities in county records across 3 counties. The error was significant, and it took 3 months to unwind. But Sylvie unwound it with the methodical care of someone who genuinely enjoyed finding mistakes in other people's paperwork. By midsummer, the county had acknowledged that the lien was invalid. Boyle's lawyer sent another letter. This one was less polite. There was a meeting in September. Constance, Sylvie, Boyle, his lawyer, a county commissioner named Ruth Ann, and a representative from the state land board who had been quietly following the case since spring. The meeting was held in the commissioner's conference room, which was small and slightly too warm, and which had a window that looked out over the grain elevator. Constance arrived early. Boyle arrived exactly on time, with the practiced punctuality of someone who wants to make it clear they're not nervous. Sylvie laid out the case in 40 minutes. She was calm, thorough, and this was the quality that Constance had come to appreciate most about her, completely without theater. She did not perform confidence. She simply presented facts in their correct order and let the facts do what facts do when they're arranged well. The 1974 agreement was valid. The stewardship had passed to Constance as Walter's heir. The land was not subject to any legitimate claim of purchase or adverse possession because it had never been abandoned. It had been actively stewarded, even if the steward hadn't known the full nature of what she was stewarding, and the land itself had been continuously maintained in the conditions specified by the original easement. Boyle was quiet throughout. He was not a man who expressed emotion easily, and Constance respected that even now, there was something about the way he listened that reminded her of Walter, and she found that observation complicated and set it aside. When Sylvie finished, the room was quiet. Then the State Land Board representative, a soft-spoken man named Crawford, spoke. He said that the state had an interest in the matter that went beyond the property dispute. Conservation easements of this type, he said, were increasingly valuable, not just ecologically, but as part of the state's long-term land management framework. The 400 acres in question represented the last intact riparian corridor in the county's northern quarter. It was habitat for 3 species that the state was actively trying to protect under its Natural Heritage Program. The state would be willing, Crawford said, to formally adopt administrative oversight of the easement, to become the institutional holder that the Palliser Land Conservancy had once been, provided the stewardship agreement was confirmed and the legal complications resolved, which meant that the land would be permanently, institutionally protected, which meant that no one, not Boyle, not any future buyer, not any future county commissioner, could ever develop it, log it, or convert it from what it was. Boyle looked at his lawyer. His lawyer said nothing useful. Boyle looked at Constance. "You knew about this the whole time?" he said. "No," Constance said. "I found out this year." Walter knew. Walter knew. He was the steward. He took it seriously. Boyle was quiet again. Then he said something that surprised her. He was a better man than most people knew. His voice was flat, not generous, just accurate. "Yes," Constance said. "He was." The formal resolution came in November, 6 weeks after the meeting. Constance's stewardship was confirmed. The State Land Board assumed administrative oversight. The Palliser Acres were formally designated as a conservation area under the state's Natural Heritage Program. There was a small notice in the county paper, a brief column inch, much like the one that had announced Harlan Gifford's retirement 50 years earlier. Terrence Boyle did not contest the final ruling. The morning the ruling was confirmed, Constance walked out to the pasture before breakfast. The light was low and flat, the way autumn light in Montana gets when it's close to winter, gold and thin, and somehow both warm and cold at the same time. Riddle came to the fence without being called. She put her hand on his neck. He lowered his head. "Thank you," she said. It was a quiet thing to say to a horse, and she said it without embarrassment. Riddle exhaled slowly, a long, low breath that misted in the cold air. She stood there for a while, her hand on his neck, both of them looking north toward the 400 acres of protected land, the land that would stay wild, that would stay intact, that would hold its shape through all the seasons to come, because one man had made a promise and another man had kept it, and a woman had been patient enough to find the key. The weeks that followed the ruling had a particular quality that Constance would later try to describe to Nora, who drove up from Billings in December and sat at the kitchen table drinking tea while the snow came sideways across the north pasture. It wasn't triumphant, Constance said, searching for the right word. It was more like settled, like something finally came to rest. Nora looked at her mother across the table. She had her father's eyes, the same steady gray, the same quality of attention. "Are you angry that he kept it from you?" she asked. Constance thought about this honestly. "No," she said. "I was briefly, but I understand it now. He wasn't keeping a secret from me. He was keeping a promise to someone else. Those are different things. The promise was yours to keep, at the end," Nora said. "It was," Constance said, "and I kept it. That feels like the point." She told Nora about Harlan Gifford, the career, the obituary, the letter. She told her about the photograph in the attic she'd been too grief-heavy to go through properly for 11 years, and about the strange, oblique way that grief sometimes works, hiding things from you at the same time that it preserves them. Nora listened without speaking, which was her father's habit and, Constance thought, one of the better things he had given her. In January, Constance wrote a letter to the Crater Falls Town Historical Society. She included a copy of Harlan Gifford's photograph and a brief account of what she had discovered. She thought he deserved to be remembered, not as a footnote in a conservation dispute, but as a man who had spent his working life doing quiet, unglamorous, essential work and who had, in his final year, trusted a young man he barely needed to trust. The Historical Society wrote back and said they would include the materials in their records. She also had a conversation with Otto, who had kept Gifford's box for 30 years out of a sense of propriety he'd never been able to name. She told him what she'd found and thanked him for keeping it. He was quiet on the phone for a moment, and then he said, "I always figured it was important. Figured the right person would come along to make sense of it." "You could have thrown it away," Constance said. "Yeah," he said, with the tone of a man for whom that had never been a real option. "But why would I do that?" In the spring, Constance had a bench installed at the edge of the north pasture, facing the Palliser Acres. Cedar, simple construction, nothing elaborate. She sat on it most mornings when the weather allowed, with coffee, watching the light come across the land that would always stay as it was. Riddle came to stand near her when she was there. Not always, not every morning, but often enough. She had stopped paying attention to what the neighbors said about him. She suspected she always had, in the ways that actually mattered. There is a version of this story that ends with the legal victory, with the county notice and the state land board's signature and the satisfying thump of institutional finality. That version is true, but it is not complete. The complete version includes Riddle. He was, by any practical measure, a horse of no utility. He could not be ridden by strangers, could not be shown, could not be sold. He contributed nothing to the operation of the farm in any way that could be entered into a ledger. He ate, he aged, he stood in the pasture looking at horizons. He was, as Phil Dutton had once said, an animal who had never done a day's work in his life. Except, he had carried a secret for 11 years without ever being asked and without ever revealing it to the wrong hands. He had waited, in the only way an animal can wait, without narrative, without expectation, without any understanding of resolution, for the person who would eventually look closely enough and stay patient enough to find what he was carrying. If you wanted to call that work, you could. It would not be wrong. Constance turned 62 that May, the same age Walter had been when he died. She marked the occasion without ceremony, as she marked most things. She sat on the cedar bench and drank her coffee and watched the morning light move across the Palliser acres, and she thought about the strange architecture of a life, the ways in which the things that seem like liabilities turn out to be the most essential things, and the ways in which trust, extended across time, becomes something almost structural. Walter had trusted Harlan Gifford. Gifford had trusted Walter. Walter had trusted a horse. The horse, in his patient, uncomplicated animal way, had trusted Constance without ever having been asked to make a decision about it. And Constance had trusted the feeling that there was something worth finding, something worth the cost of hay and senior feed and vet bills and the opinions of neighbors who couldn't see what she saw. The trust had traveled, person to person and person to animal, across 50 years, and it had arrived intact. In late summer, the state's Natural Heritage team conducted a survey of the Palliser acres and published their findings. The corridor, they reported, contained breeding habitat for sandhill cranes, a population of native cutthroat trout in the creek that ran through the northern edge, and a stand of old-growth cottonwood that was, according to the botanist's notes, among the oldest documented specimens in the county. None of this had been created by any human decision in the past 50 years. It had simply been allowed to be, protected by paperwork and promise and a small brass key and an old gray horse with an unusually long mane. The county paper ran a story. It was longer than a column inch this time. They mentioned Walter. They mentioned Harlan Gifford. They mentioned the legal proceedings and the state designation. They did not mention Riddle. Constance noticed this and found she did not mind. Not everything that matters needs to be in the record. She cut the article out and kept it in the same kitchen drawer where Walter had kept receipts and rubber bands and the small accumulated miscellany of a long life on a working farm. She put it there because she felt, obscurely, that it belonged there, that it was an extension of whatever had begun long before she knew to look for it. Riddle would be 30 years old that winter, if the vet's estimate was right. He was gray in the way that very old horses go gray. Silver everywhere now, even the muzzle, even the legs. He moved more slowly. He slept more deeply. He spent the long summer evenings standing at the north fence with his eyes half closed, patient as weather. He was not useless. He had never been useless. He was a guardian of a thing he did not understand, doing his job as perfectly as any guardian can, which is to say, faithfully, quietly, and without any expectation of recognition. Some stories you carry for years before you understand what they mean. And some stories carry things for you, in the folds of time, in the texture of silence, in the deep, tangled mane of a horse standing in a winter pasture, until the moment you're finally ready to receive them. Constance Vale did not set out to save 400 acres of wild land. She set out to understand her husband. She set out to honor a feeling she couldn't name, which kept her walking to that fence every morning even when there was no practical reason to keep walking. She followed the thread without knowing where it led, and the thread led somewhere real. The ranchers stopped talking about Riddle after the county paper ran the story. Not all of them apologized. Apologies are rare in places where pride runs as deep as the water table. But the subject changed. the way subjects do when the narrative shifts past the point of comfortable mockery. Terrence Boyle ran into Constance at the grain cooperative in the spring, as he often did. He held the door for her. She thanked him. They did not discuss the land. They discussed the weather, which was cooperative, and the grain prices, which were not. They parted without rancor. It was enough. There is something in this story about patience, about what it means to tend to something without knowing its full value, to feed and water and care for a creature or a relationship or a piece of land, because it is there and it is asking for care, and to trust that the meaning will arrive in its own time. There is something in it, too, about the messages we leave for the people who come after us, not in documents, not in wills, not in the formal architecture of estate planning, but in the quieter places, in what we chose to protect, in what we asked someone else to carry, in the gap between what we said and what we meant and what another person eventually found by looking closely. Walter didn't tell Constance everything. He ran out of time. But he had organized the world in such a way that the telling could happen without him. That is a kind of love. An unusual one, maybe. A patient, cryptic, roundabout kind of love. But love, at its most essential, is simply the act of arranging things so that something good continues after you stop being able to tend to it. By that measure, Walter Vale had done very well. If you're still here at the end of this story, then you know what it asks of you. Not agreement, not gratitude, not anything formal. Just this. Look a little more closely at the things you've been told have no value. Stay a little more patient with the things that haven't explained themselves yet. The key might already be there. It might just be waiting for the right morning. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.